Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Ann Peters from the Pulitzer Center, and we're so pleased today to partner with the University of California, Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, along with NLGJA and Women in Media to present Reporting on Gender with an Intersectional Lens. As we wait for more folks to join us, please let us know in the chat where you're listening in from. Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism is an important partner in the Pulitzer Center's Campus Consortium Network. And together we created this program today to share a range of reporting in this sphere and to aid journalists in developing their knowledge base and their own reporting on gender, from economic empowerment for women to housing for transgender prisoners. Whether journalists are covering city halls or digging into investigative stories, how can we report with an intersectional gender lens across issues? And this is not a one-off event. Today's conversation is the first in a series we are building with the aim to create a more extensive in-person forum in the fall. We are in the process of identifying larger topics and themes that our conversations will focus on in future panels, and we're eager for your suggestions. So please feel free to share those ideas with our colleagues at Berkeley and to us at the Pulitzer Center. Share them too as part of your questions for the panelists. We're eager for a robust Q&A and for your involvement in the conversation. What we'd also like to make sure of is that you add your questions throughout our session today via the Q&A function. Otherwise, please note all attendees are muted. We are also recording this session and will post it online to share further. On another note, we would appreciate if you would stay a bit longer once this session ends to participate in a brief survey. Now I'd like to hand the microphone over to my colleague from Berkeley, Deirdre English.
Thank you so much, Anne. It's been a pleasure for us at Berkeley to work with you on co-producing this vital first step in our kind of deconstructed conference that we hope to keep rolling into next fall with more panels. So I want to thank my colleagues who helped pull this together, Julie Hirano and Marlena Telvik, and also Women in Media student group here, and the NLGJA, another student group, which produced a great poster for today's event. I want to just introduce someone that we're very proud to call an alumna of the J School, Tasneem Raja. Tasneem is now the editor-in-chief of the Oakland Side, a local newsroom right here in the Bay Area. And I love that she says that their mission is to investigate systems, not just symptoms. And I hope that'll be something we always bear in mind. Before returning to Oakland, Tasneem was the executive editor and co-founder of the Tyler Loop, a nationally recognized nonprofit local news startup. She was a former senior editor at NPR and Mother Jones. And she has written and reported for many national outlets, including The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Mother Jones, and NPR, on a wide range of subjects, including many that are related to data, to race, and to journalism. She was also a senior editor at Code Switch. So she lives in Oakland and with her husband, her 2 dogs, and her 8-month-old little girl. If I have that right. 8 months, Tasneem? And over to you.
Yes, that's right. Thank you so much, Deirdre, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to all of us. Thank you to all of you for joining us today on this really important conversation, this timely conversation. I think a conversation that feels especially urgent to us right now as we are coming off the heels of a global pandemic, headlong into another global crisis. And we're starting to realize that to be able to do a good job, both as reporters and I think as human beings in these moments of collective crisis, we have got to start thinking more intersectionally. it's a term that we've become more familiar with over the years. Some of us, were way ahead and have been steeped in, the theory and practice of intersectionality for many years. You're going to hear from one of the members of our panel who is a foremost reporter on issues of gender at the 19th, for example, and I'm really eager to get their definition of what we mean by gender, what we mean by intersectionality. So important to define our terms. And as we're going to hear about specific stories that all of our panelists have been investigating, reporting, teasing out over the past few months and years, we're really going to be focusing in on none of these issues, race, class, identity, geography, age, ability, I could go on, happens in a vacuum, happens in a silo. Our lives are intersectional, ourselves are intersectional. And as reporters, how do we need to be prepared to engage with the complexity of that reporting? So that's a little bit of what we're going to be unpacking here today. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you to our incredible panelists. And as I introduce you, panelists, please feel free to join via video as well. Natalie Alcoba is a Pulitzer Center grantee, an Argentine-Canadian journalist based in Buenos Aires. She writes extensively about the feminist movement in Argentina and is interested more broadly in collective organization in Latin America. And I'm personally so interested in talking with journalists who are thinking thoughtfully and doing interesting things at the intersection of collective action and journalism. Alcoba has produced short documentaries on the impact of the pandemic on female workers, land occupations, and the legalization of abortion. Welcome, Natalie. Lawrence Andrea is a public safety and breaking news reporter for the Indianapolis Star. Before joining the Star, he covered politics and breaking news for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel and PolitiFact Wisconsin. Andrea was a 2020 Pulitzer Center reporting fellow who focused on the migrant crisis in Greece. You're going to be hearing more about that in just a few minutes, including efforts by women to tell their stories and the stories of other refugees through their own photography and filmmaking. Welcome, Lawrence. Ashley Okwuosa is a Nigerian journalist whose stories on immigration, education, and gender have been published in the Boston Globe, the Christian Science Monitor, WNYC, Quartz, and others. She currently works as a reporter and researcher for Maternal Figures. This is a remarkable project that I really can't wait for you guys to hear about. As I started to dig in, I realized we could have an entire session on this project and really any of these reporters' recent work. She's also a Pulitzer Center grantee. Forgive me for not silencing my phone. And Kate Sosin is the LGBTQ+ reporter for the 19th, focusing on transgender rights, incarceration, politics, and public policy. The 19th is an independent nonprofit newsroom reporting at the intersection of gender, politics, and policy. Previously, Sosin worked at Logo TV, Into, Windy City Times, and NBC News, and at NBC News conducting deep dive investigations into transgender prison abuse and homicides. Welcome, Kate. So, Kate, as I was mentioning at the beginning of my introductions, I think it's so important to define our terms. And I imagine that due to your B, you've probably immersed yourself in reporting and research about the concept and construction of gender more than just about anybody in this room, this virtual room. Could you, I'm gonna put something heavy on you, forgive me for that. Could you offer us a working definition of what we might mean when we talk about gender, with the understanding that everybody who's involved in this conversation today on some level gets that there is no single or universal definition? Give us something to start with.
Yeah, so I love this question. I think for me, I always go back to a definition of gender that I read years and years ago by a gender theorist called Ricky Ann Wilkins. And she said the gender was a system that punishes bodies for how they look, for the shape or color of their skin, for their size. And she said that she did that not to collapse our differences, but to emphasize our connections. So, and I really like that. That really sat with me, because when I think about gender, I think about it as a system that sort of ties us together in terms of, when I think about LGBTQ+ people, I'm like, what is the thing? Why do we all share this acronym? What is that? And it's the system of gender. And it's the same thing with women, And what are the intersections that we share with communities of color? What are the economic issues? And gender works in all of these ways to kind of tie us together. And so when we start to break that apart and look at those intersections, gender weaves throughout all of that. It's this system that says that historically women can't vote, or that only white women can vote, and that men are the only people who can wear pants, or that men cannot cry or break down or have to take out the trash, or whatever the rule is given the time period that we're in. And so the more that we break down that system and say, hey, these are the parts of gender that we really like or feel good about or want to embrace, and these are the parts that don't work for us, like we all have gender and we're operating within it, then we can start to sort of get really interesting about it. So that's kind of how I think about gender. And that's kind of how we talk about gender at the 19th.
Yeah, as a system of practices that we may or may not be aware that we're engaging with at any given moment. Kate, sticking with you for a moment, I know that your reporting looks at the way that a growing number of state senators are using state legislation to try and make life more difficult for trans people, especially trans kids, especially but not exclusively by any means. This is often about who gets to play sports and the teams that they can play on, whether or not parents can get health care for their kids in ways that work for their kids. And we've seen these endless waves of, bathroom bills aimed at telling kids how to go to the bathroom. I want to actually twist this question a little bit and say, I know that one source of frustration for organizers and reporters and other people who pay attention to these topics is how reactive a lot of their work sometimes has to be around some of these stories. Basically, these aren't stories until somebody decides they want to throw some logs on the culture war fire and introduce some new legislation banning something that almost no one wants to see banned if we look at public surveys. And then reporters have to go and report on that legislation, and you are one of those reporters drawing more attention to it and getting more people upset, and the cycle continues. As a reporter who focuses on gender, how do you think about the role that you and your work play or could play in these moments that I'm sure often feel very exhaustingly cyclical?
Yeah, I like to think about this as, I feel like when we learn to report, we learn two different things. One is like, we must be fair and balanced and show both sides, right? Like we're taught that, or objective, or whatever it is like this. And I think a lot of us are sort of giving up that that old way of thinking, because like we have to recognize that we're all people and we have so many biases that we all bring in. And then the other is that we speak truth to power, right? Whatever that looks like for each of us, and that we have to just do our best to honor whatever that's going to be and try to speak to truth to power. And for us, that is acknowledging the humanity of every single one of us and drawing a hard line at that and saying, like, look, crossing the humanity or degrading the dignity of any person, any group of people is a hard line for us in our newsroom. And that is going to be true no matter who it is. And this is where we're going to start from. And so I think when I set out to report, whether it's on trans people or any group of people, I try to make my goal to be, how can I help people get to a place where they're able to look at this issue as a people issue, right? Who are the people that they're not able to see because they don't have those people in their lives, right? Like, how do they see the impact? So that, only 42% of people, according to polls, know a trans person. Less of them know a trans kid. So can I help them get to know a trans kid and understand what that really means and looks like, so it's not such a scary issue? And I think that's kind of the best we've got, right? Like, and that's the beauty of journalism. Just like,
right, that whether or not these policy proposals are fair, being undertaken in good faith, productive, they will have impacts. Whether they succeed or not, they will have impacts. And where can we come in as reporters? I like your framework of start with people and making people's stories visible. Along those lines, Ashley, you've been looking at specific ways that people in cities and towns and villages across Nigeria have been trying to do something about the fact that pregnant women in Nigeria are dying at mind-boggling rates. The country is trying to get down to less than 70 women dying during childbirth for every 100,000 babies that are born. Currently, it's at something more like about 500 women dying for every 100,000 babies that are born, which is obviously an incredibly daunting hill to climb. So this is obviously reporting at the intersection of race and gender and huge global economic equity questions around, who has access to clinics with basic medical equipment. I was reading in your reporting, some people are having to travel in difficult conditions to clinics where there may or may not be a blood pressure monitor when they get there. But I think it's really important that you didn't think that it was enough to report a series of narrative features, say, about different ways that people are trying to do something about these terrible maternal mortality numbers across Nigeria. You did do that reporting and you continue to do, but you also did something else. Can you tell us about the maternal figures database?
Sorry, I was looking for the mute button. Thank you for that, Tasneem. So the database it's kind of started with the question of, maternal health more generally. I think when you're looking at the newspapers in Nigeria, you're always seeing kind of, different initiatives, different international agencies, different, government agencies with a goal to reduce maternal deaths in one way or the other. But there was always little follow through on the solution. And I think also maternal health, the conversation around maternal health in Nigeria is always governed by these international factors. It's almost 2 decades ago, it was the MDG, the Millennium Development Goals, and Nigeria kind of meeting a certain number by 2015. Now it's the SDGs. And, there's this arbitrary goal and every country has to meet it, but there's no look at what are the ways that countries are meeting it, what are the challenges that countries are facing individually, and what are the building blocks that they're trying to put to get there. So I think what this was going to be, we started this in 2020 with the goal of saying at least by 2030, wherever Nigeria is, at least we'll have a roadmap to kind of look at what steps did it take, where did it fall short, and where could it have done better. And I think that really is the goal of maternal figures. Right now, we have about 161 different interventions ranging from, funding projects by USAID, DFID, the World Health Organization, to state level programs, to national programs, and to even community level programs. So that's the premise of it. And then we're using journalism. We're kind of encouraging journalists to report about it. And they're just building this kind of circular database. We put the information there, journalists are reporting about it, and they put it back in the database. So you kind of have a place where you're tracking what's happening. And that's kind of how it works.
Yeah. I mean, you've built this sort of online directory, right? You're putting facts about dozens or hundreds of these various programs that people have been trying for, it looked like, at least a couple decades across Nigeria to bring down these numbers. And I'm really interested to hear, what did you think that this approach might achieve in terms of the impact that journalism can have on a problem like this, that more traditional narrative reporting alone might not be able to do?
I think I like to think of it as accountability and a solutions, like, mixing solutions journalism and accountability journalism, but also I also think of it like showing your work. I think when we are reporters, we're kind of, reporting on a program and, we do things, it's kind of insular. A lot of people don't know how, a lot of the reporting we do comes together, but this was an idea of, if someone were to write a story about maternal health in Nigeria, like this could be a story and it stands on its own, but it's the building blocks of a story. So that, I think that's kind of what it was. And also making sure that information about maternal health is accessible to everyone. Although a lot of the people who use our database are journalists, they're, people who just kind of want to know about what's going on in their state, what's going on in their local government, what's going on with, this state program, what is the status of this? They have questions. And I think in the story that I even reported about with the support of the Pulitzer Center, I was talking about this one major national program, and I went to communities and people had no idea that it even existed. So I think we're kind of hoping to take this information that lives in the press releases and lives in the government, documents and the policy documents and kind of bring it to everyone.
Yeah. I'm hearing both you and Kate talking about how our journalists, our toolkit as journalists, we need to have a lot of different kinds of tools in there. And one thing I think that many of us who are reporting on issues of gender, race, identity, Kate, you were describing these things as as punishing constructs. We are often asking people to share their trauma through storytelling because we hope it will achieve some impact. And what I found really intriguing about your work in reporting on Nigeria, Ashley, was it was kind of putting these two forms of journalism side by side. And along those lines, Natalie, I'd really love to hear a little bit more from you about your reporting that you've done with support from the Pulitzer Center to kind of catch people up. You've been reporting on what's going on with domestic workers in Argentina. So we're talking about people who clean homes or take care of other people's children or, care for elderly people. In Argentina, household workers who almost exclusively, I saw in your reporting numbers from 95% to 99% of them are women or people who identify as women. And they were one of the very last groups who were allowed to start working again after many months of lockdown. This is not a small group of people. They make up nearly a fifth of all working women in the country. And many of them are working as unregistered labor. So they're not getting sick days, they're not getting other forms of protections that other employees in Argentina surely take for granted. But your reporting wasn't only about the fact that domestic workers in Argentina were being treated badly before the pandemic and are being treated badly during the pandemic. You reported on what happened next. Can you tell us what happened next?
Yes, definitely. Thanks, Tasneem. So the project that I undertook with a colleague of mine here in Argentina, a photographer, her name's Anita Puchard-Serra, we kind of came to the story together. We'd noticed these stories that were bubbling up about this cohort. There's one woman who ultimately, like this some people describe themselves as this army of women who head out every morning to take care of households, other people's households. And they're this indispensable part of this society. And in some ways, so visible and yet so invisible because there isn't this acknowledgement of how, without them, it all falls apart. And in the pandemic, they were that marginalization, that kind of being cast to one side was exacerbated even further. And what we try to focus on and that what I think is interesting is a situation in which the marginalization increases and in that space empowerment happens. So these women started to organize for the first time, started to look around and realize that they were always on their own and they really were on their own. They only had, I should rephrase that. They had each other, but that was it. And so they decided to start heading out onto the street in manifestations and in protests, demonstrations. For many of them, it was the first time that they'd ever taken that kind of a stand. And I think about how that is this action to make yourself seen, in this society, by the society. Beyond those protests, they created unions. They created different collectives that, went from, organizing bundles of food to help each other out, to literally make it through the week, to organizing, demands of legislators, figuring out what it is that their priorities were, physically delivering these kinds of demands into the hands of people who were in decision-making positions. And what happens, along the way of that transformation is such such an individual experience. For some women, they literally, they'd never held a megaphone, they'd never made a public speech before, and so they were at these rallies, kind of, gathering the masses and communicating this message, and you could see them in some cases like kind of getting lost in that moment, in that space that they were able to occupy for the first time. So it was a story. It is a story of exploitation that continues, of vulnerability, layers of vulnerability, and of empowerment. And I think for me as well, one of the things that I thought about a lot was a comment that a political scientist who works a lot with these women had made to me, which is that, it's not the women, like we have to deconstruct this idea that the women themselves who are vulnerable. It's the context that makes them, that's made them vulnerable. It's the fact that, you know, even though there's legislation that says that employers should register them, you know, the vast majority continue to work unregistered work. And for many, it's because they're able to earn more in the day-to-day that way. But that's a problem of, you know, their work not being valued in the way it should be, right? Like they're impossible decisions to make. Do I make it today or do I make it next week? So yeah, I think you know, it was also about challenging and going beyond, you know, whom we think these women are, and that there isn't one kind of woman within this group, one kind of person, right? Like that's, you know, that there are some women who were in more precarious positions, you know, a cohort that was vulnerable, but that some were in more difficult positions than in others. A hierarchy within that same group. Which,
right. I mean, I think it's something a lot of us wrestle with who are reporting on, you know, issues of, we all know the issues of race and class and gender are really, it's really reporting about power, and it's really about reporting on who has power and who has less power, and, you know, the push and pull that happens there. And I'm really interested in, you know, you're talking about these women, this community is not a monolith. Within them, they have different lives, different lived experiences. They're coming together to form and join unions, to demand better pay and conditions. And they're also learning about and teaching each other about collective action and the history of organizing in Argentina, as I was reading from your reporting, which is actually a very long and rich history. And as I was reading your work, I was struck by the fact that reporting on so-called women's issues and women's empowerment, very often, at least in my experience, you know, I'm looking at Western media, is very often reporting on things that affect white, Western, upper middle class, you know, cisgender, professional, straight women. I know you've spent some time at, you know, larger, more mainstream media companies in your career as well. And these aren't places that are necessarily used to or very good at reporting on what's going on with women who work hourly jobs or don't have, you know, secure housing, secure healthcare. You use that word empowerment in the title, you know, in your remarks just now, also in the title of your reporting project. I would love to hear more from you about the kind of frames or narratives of empowerment that you were interested in exploring with this work or complicating with this work. And if there were frames or narratives that you were also really looking to avoid, you know, pitfalls you were looking to avoid falling into.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly, I think it's exactly right when we think about whom it is that we talk about when we talk about the women's movement, and it happens here in Argentina as well, right? Like the middle class woman who has the privilege to be able to go out on the street on any given day and scream and say, you know, look at me, this is what I'm missing, and how you know this context of the pandemic, I guess you know, this is a cohort of women that for the most part don't have that privilege, and yet we're in a position where they had no other choice but to kind of assume that role. I wanted to be thinking, and I wanted to be aware, and in fact I learned along the way the various other ways or things that were not necessarily visible to me. So a section of a chunk of a group of these women, many of these women are migrants, are migrant workers here in Argentina, whom are already othered by this society, whom are already seen as, you know, something different from the mainstream, and who, you know, perhaps have you know, their legal status, depending on how, you know, how they're here, could put them in a more precarious position. So in many of these cases, these women, you know, even the question of, you know, or in the early months of the pandemic, when no one was able to go out onto the street, and these are people whom really had no other way of making ends meet if they didn't find some way of working, right? Like this is kind of the narrative of this part of the world where you've got this enormous part of the workforce that is day to day, that is what we call the informal economy, informal workers, have nothing to fall back on. And so how do you expect, or how do you help or sustain that huge group of people in a context where they can't make ends meet? And so you had certain women and certain employers who would circumvent the rules in some ways and reclassify their workers so that they could come to their house. So instead of saying that they were cleaning their house, they said that they were doing something else. For some people, they themselves would describe themselves as, the lucky ones who were able to go to work in a context in which they, were taking a particular risk with their health, in the middle of the pandemic, not really knowing what that was going to mean. But then also, if you were a migrant woman who, was exposing yourself to things like deportation, we're taking other kinds of risks that weren't necessarily obvious or weren't talked about by the mainstream. And so how even the solutions that were presented in some circumstances put them in a position where they, had to make an impossible choice, right? Like I head out to work, or I head out to work because I have to be able to feed my family. But in the process of doing that, I take, a risk in terms of my own stability here in this country. So I think, sorry.
Well, no, I was just going to say that, you're touching on these layers, again, these intersections, right, of identity. Nobody's, no community is made of one kind of person, and no person is intersecting with, just one community. I couldn't help but think of the way that we've been reading the story of what happened at the Stonewall Inn, right, like decades ago, and the way that story of kind of what has been termed by some as like the birth of the queer rights movement in this country. The popular understanding of it for people who bothered to learn that history at all was, that you saw a lot of middle class white gay men at the forefront of our understanding of who was kind of putting themselves on the line. I've been really happy to see certainly in recent years, a more widespread complication of that narrative, and saying there were, Black and brown trans teenagers who were very involved in a very, very risky way in, pushing that movement forward. So that's, I'll leave that detour there and say that you also touched on an issue that brings us to Lawrence's reporting, which is migrant identity. Lawrence, you've been doing some really great reporting on the experiences of people from different countries who are now all living in Greece as refugees, having secured asylum there, including two young women from Iran who are twin sisters. You can tell us, but I took their age to be maybe teenagers. They're living in a refugee camp on Lesbos, if I understood correctly, and they produced a really remarkable short film about other women who have also been refugees in Greece. Can you tell us a little bit about their film and what their vision was, what their goal was?
Sure. Yeah. Well, for context, these twins that we're talking about and others that I spoke with for this story, they learned this photography and filmmaking on Lesbos in the Moria refugee camp, which before it burned down in 2020 was known as one of the most overcrowded and kind of terrible camps in the region. But yeah, once they learned these how to make films and how to make images, they started using those skills to do something that they told me they weren't able to do in Afghanistan and Iran, to kind of speak out about the problems in their home country, and also kind of start telling the stories of other migrants and other migrant women who came from all over the world to Greece seeking asylum, and kind of their struggle and their success. They said that, I guess, they they made a couple films since then, but this one particular film follows around about 5 women, I think one from South Africa, a couple from Afghanistan, who had these passions for either teaching English or dancing or doing like kickboxing, I think it was, and they weren't able to pursue those dreams where they lived. But in Greece, they're able to kind of start doing these things. And the director, her name's Nahid, she said, we wanted to show that women could do everything or anything.
You know, I think it's so important that we all leave behind notions that, you know, reporting on so-called gender issues is primarily the responsibility of or the interest of people who, you know, identify as women or trans or non-binary or basically anything other than, you know, straight cisgender male. Lawrence, I'd love to hear what has surprised you or impacted you the most over the course of the time that you've been talking with refugees in Greece, many of them women, about their experiences in terms of what it means to be, you know, you're somebody who isn't typically identified, I'm sure, by the world as a reporter who's particularly interested in gender. What surprised you about the process of, you know, getting to know these sources and getting to work with them to share their stories in ways that, you know, I hope felt productive to them? I'm sure it did.
Yeah, well, sure. Well, first, I think I should say that, you know, I'm no expert in reporting on gender-related issues. I mean, I stand to learn as much as anybody else here from my colleagues on the panel. But, you know, given that I don't have that expertise or something, one way I like to approach these things is just by, you know, listening and learning as much as I can, letting these refugees, no matter who they are, you know, tell their story to me without, you know, I try to keep an open mind and go into things like this with open ears.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'd really actually love to open this up to all of our panelists. And in the meantime, I'd also like to encourage those of you joining our conversation to share your own questions at this point. You can do so via the chat, and those will be filtered through to me. I'll be checking out the questions that you guys have to share. So, you know, start thinking about things you'd like to ask our panelists. We'll be switching over to, you know, Q&A in just a moment here. Before we do that, I'd actually like to throw this question out to everybody. Feel free to jump in, folks, or I'll, you know, kind of go one by one if we need some encouragement. How can people of all genders and backgrounds investigate matters that pertain to both their identities as well as identities other than their own? How can we be responsible in our, you know, attempts to do so? What have you learned? The good, the bad, and the ugly, you know, whether these are hard lessons learned or tips and tricks that you have that, you know, seem to work more often than not to do this work responsibly and well. Kate, maybe we'll start with you.
I felt that coming. Hi. You know, I think this is such a difficult question because for a lot of, I feel like for a lot of my career, I have felt sensitive about being a trans person or a queer person who's reporting trans or queer issues and feeling like that cost me my perspective, right? And so many of us, I feel like, are in the position where we've always been questioned, like, well, if you're a part of this community, can you report on it without bias, right? And I think that's changing, right? People recognize that that is actually a strength. And at the same time, there's always this, well, how far can I take it? Like, how much humanity can I recognize in people that I identify with? And for me, there's this kind of, I think what makes a good story for me now and what drives me is a recognition that, like, we do get to speak truth to power. And if all these people are asking something, if all these people have a question, if all these people have a concern, and I know that because that is a community that I'm part of, I feel sort of affirmed in that. as I pursue a story. And that is a comfort to me. There's a privilege in being able to be one of the people who gets to ask that question. And to try to use that to have courage in terms of pursuing a story, I think, is how I like to pursue things, because otherwise I think it's really easy to second guess yourself, which I totally do. Like if an agency comes back and they're like, this is not that important, or like, we don't track that, or, why would you even ask us this? Or like, if it's, a federal agency and they're like, this is a lot to ask for. And it's like, no, all of these people are affected. Like, this is a basic, like people deserve to have an answer to this, right? And so I think for me, it's just like, it's okay to ask. And the strength of the community that I'm part of gives me that. And I feel like I am just part of the process of getting a story out. Like, I'm one person in that, and I get the byline, but it's really like a lot of people.
Following up on that, what's one thing you would love to never hear again from an editor, or one thing you would love to hear from an editor next time you're bringing them a story that is at the intersection of lots of different complicated identities?
I have to confess to you, I'm so spoiled at the 19th. Like, I've never been so supported in the stuff that I do, and the stuff that I bring them. It's hard to imagine going back. I just get stories now from other folks who are like, they wanted you to do that, and I'm like, yeah, they're like, how can we support you? What can we do? What can we? So it's been a minute since I've had pushback on things that I wanted to do. I guess what I do want to hear more from editors, not my editors really, but from other editors, is like, here's how we will put resources into hiring more folks who are closer to this work and these experiences, and here's how we'll prioritize that. Because I feel like, even in my newsroom, like, I want queer and trans people of color to be hired, and the fact that we don't have that, and I recognize, like, you can't seek people out, it's not legal, but like, naturally, if your staff gets big enough, that should just happen, right? That is like, it's something that should just be there. And it makes us a better newsroom. It makes us all better at our jobs, to be working together like that. And so that's my dream. Yeah.
Ashley, I'd love to go to you. Thank you so much for that, Kate. As you're thinking about this question, how can we, as people who personally can speak to or reflect some number of lived identities, lived experiences, and also cannot identify with and cannot relate to a far larger number of lived experiences. I'd love to hear a little bit about how you approached your reporting on maternal health. I never try to make any assumptions, so I'll let you speak to, did you have any life experiences that made you feel more or less, prepared to kind of understand the personal impacts of these experiences? And whether you did, whether you didn't, how did either those experiences or lack of those experiences kind of play out in this reporting?
Thank you for that, Tasneem. And I think what Kate said was so important. But to your question, the first thing that came to mind when I was reporting on this was, I don't have sort of lived experiences, but just being Nigerian, living in Nigeria, I do know how commonly people talk about maternal deaths. I think it's something that's always at the tip of our tongues. It's in every conversation. It's like, this happened and we've kind of normalized it. But what I realized in this reporting, particularly in building the database, was that the way we talk about maternal deaths, and everyone has alluded to it here, but it's a systems problem, right? Everything everyone is reporting here is ultimately a systems issue. And I think one of the biggest systemic problems that people talk a lot about in Nigeria is corruption. And so in the building of the database, in the reporting of this, I just saw that this was sort of the issue of maternal death, the large number in which women are dying, was just a reflection of this larger systemic issue of corruption. So even if I didn't, and that was something that all Nigerian journalists, anyone who's living and reporting about Nigeria can kind of relate to. So that was the perspective that I brought to it. And that's the perspective I think a lot of people are bringing to it. And I think also to what Kate said, the database and even reporting on this specifically was a way to say, this is one I guess one effect of corruption, and we're going to kind of focus here. It's important to focus here to kind of look in depth how corruption is kind of affecting women who are pregnant, how corruption is kind of leading to, funds not being appropriated in the right way, and how it's leading to women not going to primary healthcare centers where there isn't blood pressure, medicine. So I think looking at maternal health and sort of funneling or focusing my vision on that lens in particular, I think it's been worthwhile to see that. And I think having this conversation has kind of made me feel like it makes sense to look at this larger problem of corruption through a very narrow lens. Like that does give a lot of people a lot more information and context about, some of those other things that are going on in Nigeria. So, yeah.
I mean, I think it's something we all wrestle with as journalists, like, how do I make people care about this? People should just care about this inherently, but is there a way that I can get people to understand that, with the Oakland side, we're always trying to say it's not just parents with kids who need to care about what's going on with Oakland schools, right? It affects all of us. Natalie, along those lines, I would love to hear kind of who you thought of as the audience for your work on reporting on, collective action, organizing, being pushed by household workers in Argentina. How did you think about the audience for that work? And how did you think about that question of how do I make you care about this?
Yeah, I mean, I love that you're asking that, because I when you were asking that question of what do I not want to hear editors say to me anymore, being somebody who's living, in South America, writing for an international audience, writing for Americans, for Canadians, for Brits, because of in general, those are the publications, and having that question asked, like, why do we care? Why does this matter to people in this particular place? Why should we tell this story from Argentina when we could tell it from any number of countries? There's kind of like this idea that like Latin America is one thing, right? And why does it matter to tell it from this particular place? But I mean, so I say that, and then on the other hand, I also concur with Kate that, like, for the most part, I do get to write about what I want to write about, and I think in this story and in so many others, perhaps it's also what's happened during the pandemic. We suddenly became more aware of how similar so many of our experiences are. The question of trans rights, the question of gender-based violence, the way that changed in the pandemic, the question of gig work or the informal economy. We want to call it different things in different places, but there's this universality to a lot of our experiences that I think helped kind of open up new audiences in many senses. So I mean, I was I was hoping, I'm maybe this is going on a bit of a tangent, but one of the reasons why I moved to Argentina was this fascination with the way in which the feminist movement here has been organizing, has come like little by little, laying the groundwork, creating networks, having advocacy and people in all spheres of society, how that presence in all these different spaces was the way in which they were working towards things like, for example, the legalization of abortion, which was this huge victory. So I think that there's so much that Argentina, the quote unquote South, can teach the quote unquote North about how it is to organize and rely on each other to achieve something when there are these incredible vacuums from a state level. People ultimately hear like the way in which people organize and the facts and the community that builds comes from a necessity, right? It comes from the fact that we need to turn to each other to make things work, to get by, because otherwise we feel much more alone. And in that absence, something else happens, which is not just organizing to solve something, but creating this sense that you are with others, like creating this sense of community, I think is what I typically take away whenever I write about collective action down here. You know, it really feels like, you know, it feels like it creates joy. Like the act of collective action is creating joy here for people's creating purpose. And I was hoping that you know, through that somehow in some way that's transmitted through the stories. I was hoping that you know, you could kind of see the opportunity that happens when you stitch those connections. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I'd like to actually toss to you, Lawrence, and then open it up to everybody else. One of the questions from our Q&A here. Thank you to everybody who's been sharing some of their own questions for our incredible panelists in the chat here. So one of these, one of the questions that's come our way is, you know, in your experience, how receptive are news outlets, especially the legacy media, to stories about gender and intersectionality? Lawrence, I know that wasn't necessarily kind of the, you know, the thrust of your reporting, but your reporting certainly took up a lot of questions around intersectionality, especially given the fact that, you know, you're writing about people who are coming from a lot of different places to Greece. They're bringing with them a lot of different journeys, a lot of different stories, and they're kind of ending up in, you know, somewhat similar experiences, and then having these opportunities to create relationships with each other, to have these shared experiences along the lines of what Natalie is describing to some extent. I'd love to hear, you know, I'm interested in hearing from you, Lawrence, because correct me if I'm wrong, but I think your reporting was published in a number of different outlets. And I'm just kind of curious to hear, you know, did you find yourself, without getting into specifics of, you know, who you talked to where and why, but how were you kind of thinking about marrying your reporting to the outlet, and just any advice you might have about, you know, none of the stories that you guys are taking on are easy stories, nor are they necessarily easy stories to like sell, to pitch. If you have the benefit of being a staff reporter, it certainly does make it a little bit easier, but I think that's pretty rare. So yeah, Lawrence, just tell us a little bit about how you got outlets interested in the work that you've been doing in publishing it.
Yeah, sure. Well, when I found a story, I didn't necessarily immediately think of the outlet. In fact, I gathered as much info as I could, and actually sometimes wrote the story completely beforehand. And then I started thinking about where this would fit in, you know, an outlet's previous coverage. I didn't want it to overlap, you know, see if there's gaps or an issue somebody hasn't covered. And even, you know, if like, for example, in this, the story we were talking about earlier with the photography and film, you know, I figured somebody who deals with like a magazine or a news outlet who deals with photography and film, you know, that would fit well there. But yeah, mainly just reviewing past coverage, and then trying to figure out, you know, how this could fit in with certain outlets is how I went about doing that.
Could you tell us a little bit about that really remarkable, you know, piece that you ultimately published with National Geographic, I think in collaboration with a photographer as well? You know, just help us kind of understand what that project was.
Well, it's funny, in collaboration with the photographer was actually one of the subjects of the article. She's one of she's an Afghan woman who actually fled Afghanistan because she is part of the Hazara community who were persecuted by the Taliban. She lived in Iran for a while, but had trouble pursuing her education. So she came to Greece. And I think one thing that's very powerful about specifically what National Geographic did was they published her work, the work that I was talking about in the story, and they published her photographs of other refugees whom she's telling the stories about. She kind of under each photograph, she profiles, profiles the subject of the photograph. And I think it's very powerful that, and I think it's important that she's telling these stories as well. And it's not just me, because she has the insights of what it's like to be a migrant, what it's like to have to leave your country. And so she has a more informed approach, even though, I could do hours and hours of research. I'll never know what it's actually like to be in that situation. So I think that's a powerful part of that piece. Just she's also, doing that reporting as well.
Yeah. I'd love to open that question up to anybody else who might have any advice for our listeners. How, in your experience, how receptive are news outlets to these stories about gender and intersectionality? Natalie, I imagine you have some information to share here.
Yeah, I want to say something about that, but then also what Lawrence was just commented on the photographer herself telling that story, and how those opportunities, if we can find them, where we hand over we relinquish control, we hand over the microphone, we give people the camera, creates these special, or I just think it creates a whole other depth to the project that we're ultimately putting forward. So in the work that I did, one of the pieces that we learned was that for some women, who found themselves where they suddenly had lost their job, there was an organization that was kind of coaching them and giving them tools that they could do, giving them tools so that they could essentially prove that they'd been working somewhere. So they told them, something as simple as, take a photo. In some cases, people didn't know who their actual employer, they didn't have a name, for example. They didn't know, couldn't even tell you the actual address. They just knew that it was this particular building, and they couldn't substantiate that they had worked somewhere for a certain number of times, for a certain amount of time. Things that you perhaps I didn't realize, right? Like even that experience. And so they tell them, when you're there, take a photo of something, a piece of mail or something that shows that you've been there. And so the photographer, Anita, wanted to incorporate, their participation in the project. And so, she asked a couple of these women to film themselves working. So to with their iPhone, or with their phone, whatever they had, to frame it how they wanted, and to show a piece of their labor, show them in this space, show what it looks like for them to do what they do. And then also, we also asked them to send us a couple of clips through WhatsApp, through the audio notes that are super, super common here. So yeah, I mean, that just adds a whole other proximity, I think, to the human aspect of the story. And then for me, in terms of how receptive editors are, I think, I've learned, all my whole career in Canada was in newsrooms, so it was a different kind of advocacy I felt that I had to do for stories, and also a different way in which I was viewing my own work as a journalist. I was responding a lot to what was happening. In this context, I'm telling an editor, this is why you should care. I know you should care. This is why you should care. And I've learned, like the collective organizers here, to find my allies, to find individuals that I know connect with this material and that get it. And they exist. They're in many newsrooms, and it's once that, I would even argue that's the hardest piece of that's the hardest work as a freelancer, is finding those people in which you know that there's going to be some constructive feedback. Maybe the way you framed it isn't exactly going to work for them, but there's going to be an openness, there's going to be a response, and there's going to be something that helps that story build, gives it a different path. So it's about individuals and not about organizations for me.
Mm. and, following those people as, in this field, we tend to jump around a lot and, keep tabs on them, see where they go. Another question that I'd really like to throw out to our panel, I think this is a really important question. This is a question from Lydia. Do you have a practice of trauma-informed reporting that you employ for certain projects? And has that practice changed throughout your career? So we were talking a little bit earlier about what it is that we're asking of people when we ask them to sort of bear their pain because they are hoping to move the needle. On a societal level, we're saying to them, to get people to care about this, to get people to pay attention, to get this problem to stop, perhaps, we need you to share your trauma in deeply personal, explicit ways. I think that's one aspect of what we're getting at with Lydia's question about trauma-informed reporting. There are many others as well. I'd really love to hear from you, Ashley, about what it's meant to you to talk not only, of course, with experts and practitioners, but also people who have gone through loss related to childbirth, whether that's a family member that they lost, whether a birth experience that, was deeply traumatic, and so on. How have you thought about the role of understanding what it means to understanding that interviewing somebody can also be a traumatic experience for them?
And thank you for the question, Tasneem, and thank you, Lydia. I think the experience that I have when I am talking to women who, I guess I'll start with how I kind of go about kind of approaching women, whether it's for reporting or even if it was just for maternal figures. With maternal figures, I think we're looking at talking to women on an information seeking basis. Like, we weren't telling you to sort of come and, tell us about your trauma, because we understood that would be difficult. But I think we were saying, hey, we're gathering information about this. We don't have that personal experience, but we would kind of like to have you tell us your story so that can inform our research. And we kind of also did include the caveat that this could be difficult and everything. But traditionally, if I'm working on a story, I kind of want to sit in front of you and put my recorder in your face and kind of start having that conversation. But I couldn't do that when it came to, the research and the reporting. So we actually started just sending out surveys to people and saying, hey, fill this, with as much information or as little information as you can, and tell us what you think is pertinent. We're not looking for, like the trauma, we're just kind of looking for information about the system. Where is the system failing? And then how could we use that to then inform the reporting that we're doing? So that was one approach that we took. We found that a lot of women were incredibly angry. We found that, and we also did diversify how we were approaching, subjects. It wasn't the women who had experienced loss that were also facing trauma. We also realized that a lot of healthcare workers were also kind of facing trauma, working in a system that they feel was just set up to fail, right? Like set up to kind of help them, that wasn't working with them doing their job. So that was also another situation where we experienced people who had trauma. And we also took the same approach. It was, we're not looking for quotes, we're not looking for sound bites, we're looking for information about the system. We're looking information about where the structure is failing and how you can point us in that direction. So I will say that, maybe I won't have as much experience as everyone else who's kind of been doing long form stories about, these kinds of issues. But when I did realize that when you are not reporting on a story, not focusing on a story, but you're focusing on maybe a structure, or you're focusing on building something like a database, and it's not about quotes and it's about information, it does give you the option to be more flexible in how you approach people to share their difficult stories.
You're looking at the system of, gaps in the public health network, and not just public health, but transportation and the ways in which people have to balance work and other childcare and so many other systems that we don't think of as necessarily related to maternal mortality. And you're saying, help us look at this methodically, help us look at this as a system, not just tell us about the terrible thing that happened to you. And I think that that's a fundamentally different proposition to make to, somebody who's willing to share information with you about what may have been one of the worst days of their life. If you're saying, let's talk about what didn't work for you, not just what happened to you, I think that that's a different way of getting into that, to that interview, to that information seeking. Anybody else want to jump in on this question about trauma-informed reporting and how trauma-informed reporting, informs your work?
Sorry, Kate, go ahead.
No.
You go ahead.
Okay. I want to say this is something that we've dealt with a lot in terms of, so I work a lot with folks who are incarcerated and people who are close to homicide victims, trans homicide victims, and especially with people who are incarcerated, a lot of times there has to be a conversation about, you know, information that you share, this is how it could be used and used against you. And I feel like the way that I was taught traditionally, or the way that I learned journalism traditionally, was like, try to get as much information out of people as you can to share with your readers. Like, you just want to figure out how to like sort of manipulate the most out of a story, and that makes a really good story. Like, try to get all this stuff. And the longer that I've gone on, the more that I've learned that like that's actually really a terrible way of approaching people and storytelling, that like you can destroy people by doing that. And so that it's really important to figure out what are scenarios where yes, you want to do that, and what are scenarios where you actually want to be really, really careful with people and give them lots of off ramps. And so if I'm interviewing a senator, then yeah, sure, everything's going to be on the record, and I'm going to tell them that and be really clear about that. If I'm interviewing someone who is incarcerated and being sexually assaulted and telling their story, it's going to possibly expose them to further violence, then I'm going to be really careful and say, look, if there are things that you share and later you feel like that's going to put you at further risk, it's okay to come back to me and say, like, this doesn't feel good, right? Like, let's provide safety and off ramps. And I think trauma-informed reporting means recognizing that like those stories are owned by the people who tell them, and that means like that you don't just get to like take a record and run with it, and people can come back to you, and that has to be like a working relationship. So I just wanted to add that like I've had to let go of a lot of those old reporting I think things that we've been taught in order to honor like a full person, and that has served me so well, not in terms of just like doing a story well, but building trust, and often it makes people a lot safer. And I think it falls into that like do no harm that we talk so much about.
Natalie, I know you were interested in sharing as well.
Yeah, no, I love all that, Kate. Like, if I were to think about like the Natalie that was a journalist 20 years ago when she started, and like what I would have considered to be like the ethics of a journalist then, and what I think of how I think about them now, they're, you know, thankfully I've evolved. And this question, I think a lot about this question of consent and what our responsibility is as journalists in terms of obtaining consent from the people that we are exposing, you know, who we are, you know, presenting to the world, you know, like opening them up to a whole different level of profile, and how that isn't a one-time thing. That isn't that like you told me you were okay with this here now, and you know that's it. It's like constant, it's checking back in, you know, explaining to them the process as well. You know, this is, you know, if so many times if you're working on longer term things, you know, like not having somebody feel like you came and you left and like they never heard from you again, you know, letting them know like this is why it's taking this long, this is what we're doing now, you know, I'm working on if it's a visual piece, if it's a written piece, again, kind of emphasizing that they can tell me when they don't feel comfortable and if they've changed their mind at any time, right? Like not assuming that, but I think it's our responsibility to put that on the table for them, because they can't know that. They can't know that like that we don't have all the power. I think people may have that kind of they might just think that they can't say anything, and so you got to make them really comfortable and know that that's okay, that it's theirs. And that's something that, you know, I've learned in the last few years, and I've certainly learned it even more so, you know, working independently. What is my own ethic as a journalist versus, you know, kind of blindly operating under, this is how the newsroom does it, checking with my manager, or I'm the manager and I figure out what I tell people to do, right? Like not having that institution around you. How do you, what feels right for you as a person when you're out there? Even things as, you know, because I write in English, but obviously the people that I'm interviewing don't, for the most part, don't speak English. And so what's my responsibility even to, at the very least, give them a translated copy of the story so that they can understand it? You know, I think it's my responsibility to do that. But I don't know that everybody operates like that. So there's that question. And then on the point of trauma-informed reporting, you know, I think I guess I start asking, I really kind of approach the interview with the attitude that it will be led by the person that I'm interviewing. And so I ask them, where can we start, right? Like, what would you like to talk about? I've also found that you know, more than once I've, you know, been very concerned that obviously that the material, for example, I've spoken many times to family members of femicide victims here. I've written a lot about the femicide crisis in Argentina. And so how do you have that conversation with a mother or a father, you know, to talk about their child that was brutally murdered. And then I've also many times, you know, had them say to me, no, I want to talk. No, I want, this is, every time I talk, it's like a liberation for me, right? Like I've had my own assumption of what that experience could be for them, checked and challenged, and which isn't to say that it isn't a difficult thing, but not to assume that they wouldn't want to, that you can't go there, just kind of an open, trying to approach the situation as open as possible, and then you know, asking or following the cues that they give you along the way to be able to go a little bit deeper on the story. That's how I approach those interviews.
You know, what I'm hearing so much from both of you is this idea of being explicit with ourselves and with people that we're engaging with in the course of reporting about the power that we have as journalists and about the power that we don't have as journalists. And also recognizing that, you know, we as journalism practitioners, we are not a monolith, right? Like we have been talking about people who are in newsrooms as staff reporters, people who have been staff reporters and independent reporters, people who have been in positions of management and not in management. It's, you know, it's just a very complicated system that doesn't have a lot of clear and shared and agreed upon rules. And it often feels like we're all sort of making the rules up as we go. And I think part of the power of conversations like this is to say, let's actually make some of these invisible rules visible and question our own assumptions about what is possible and why we're doing what we're doing. I think that there were a couple more questions in the chat, and then we'll go ahead and wrap. I wanted to share, Ashley, with you a question from Belle. Did the women you interviewed have any opportunities to meet and create communities and possibly organize and give them some voice and power? A question perhaps inspired by, you know, Natalie's description of what she's been reporting about in Argentina.
Yeah, thank you for that, Belle. So the women that we actually spoke to share their stories, luckily for us, we kind of approached them because they were already part of those communities, because we weren't looking for women in isolation. One, because, like, again, because of the topic of what we're discussing, it is very sensitive. It'll be difficult to kind of meet someone in isolation and ask them to share whatever it is about one of the most difficult points in their life. So we went to communities, whether it was communities that were created online or religious communities or educational communities. And we did that because we knew that we would find women sharing a diverse range of stories, you know, different experiences, but then we also knew that it would kind of be more effective to have them speak together. So that was kind of one thing we did. We never looked for people to talk to us in isolation. It was always about making sure we found communities where people supported each other. And it, you know, it kind of made the reporting and research we did richer. And then I hopefully also gave them support to share that kind of thing with us.
Yeah. a question from Richard. What common mistakes do you see cis male reporters make, and how can they be avoided? I'll open this up to anybody who wants to, reflect on it. I'll go ahead and say that in my experience, over the last, I guess, 2 decades at this point of being both a reporter and an editor, I'm not going to necessarily limit my response to this question to cis male reporters, but I will say, more generally speaking, I think a habit actually that I'd love to see more newsrooms build and more journalists build is related to something we were talking about a few seconds ago, which is being explicit about the power that we hold. I think that there's a narrative that we like to have as journalists, right? Which is, we're here to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. We're on the side of the underdog. We don't make a lot of money. We're in this because we have some noble mission that we're trying to tackle. And I think that all of these things can be true, and also people that I've encountered in my reporting certainly have checked my own assumptions over the course of my career, that I am not somebody with enormous power, that my platform is not a platform that has enormous power. And Natalie, I think you were speaking so well to what it means to slow down, what it means to bring these kind of, again, interdisciplinary notions of what does consent look like when we're talking about interviews? What can we learn from people who are thinking about bodily consent, and what does it mean to incorporate some of those questions and practices into our work as interviewers? Because the work that we're doing is often very, very intimate, and it is often very relational. So I guess I would say, Richard, that from where I stand, I kind of feel like onboarding into this field or onboarding into a newsroom should kind of come with an opportunity to say, what power do I bring, seen or unseen, to the relationships I have with people that I'm out there encountering while I'm reporting, and what do I need to know about how I wield that power? What do I need to know about how I acknowledge that power and am explicit about it? And what kinds of upfront conversations do I need to have with people about my blind spots, what I do know, what I don't know, and getting away from this idea that we're all just sort of these neutral blank slates. I think a lot of work has been done to chip away at those notions, complicating these ideas of objectivity, for one thing, that Kate was bringing up at the very beginning of our conversation. I do see some movement happening on those fronts, but I think those of us on this panel, those of us, in this conversation, as listeners and contributors of questions, we're probably a lot more primed to be ready to kind of be explicit about the fact that we do have power as journalists. I'm really excited about the ways in which the work that you guys are all doing, that you reporters are all doing, engages with those questions, and that the talking about how you're doing this work can be a model for other people to say, oh, there actually are professional steps that we can take to get better at this thing. So Richard, I hope that that's satisfying. Ashley, please.
Yeah, I think the only thing I wanted to add, especially when it comes to covering something like maternal death, it seems so singular, right? Like that the thesis of the stories that kind of women are dying, and this is not a mistake that just I think it's a mistake that I could make, anyone could make when you're covering something like this, because it's so singular. You think that the only story is that I'm going to write about the fact that women are dying, and that's simply it. But even in that tragedy, there are other stories. Like there's stories of resilience, there's stories of systemic failure, there are stories of hope. So I think making sure that even when you're reporting on something that is incredibly devastating, incredibly difficult, you're also finding a way to tell the fuller story even within that singular focus. And this is something I try to remind myself about too. But that's the one thing that comes to mind from Richard's question.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, Ashley. And I also wanted to say, I love how you talk about, Tasneem, how you talk about being explicit. And I feel like being explicit about our role and, you know, that relationship that we have with the people that we are interviewing also inevitably will make us more accountable. And that's uncomfortable, right? Like, I think the distance that we lived under as journalists and this notion of objectivity and like your information is mine and I do with it is way more comfortable for you, right? Like, it's harder when you've actually established something human with the person that you are talking to, and I think that's I mean, we have to wrestle with how that, you know, the complicated facets of that, and whom we are accountable to, the question of to whom, yeah, which is, you know, also something that is, I think, a moving target. But yeah, we have to like kind of stay in that discomfort. I think that's good for us as journalists.
Absolutely. I think we have addressed the really excellent questions that have been shared with us by members of our audience today. Panelists, any final thoughts, remarks, questions for each other? Anything else you'd like to share before we go our separate ways? Okay, great. Well, oh, I'm sorry, Kate, please go ahead.
I just wanted to say thank you for having me. This is so lovely to join you all. What an honor.
Well, before I sign off and hand it over to you, Anne, I want to thank you, Natalie, Lawrence, Ashley, Kate. I have learned so much from all of you, and I feel that I will be going into the next work week more thoughtful, you know, better journalist, hopefully, because of everything you've shared. And thank you to the panel organizers for sharing links to all of our panelists' work in the chat. I really, really encourage you to check it out. One of the things I love so much about doing this work when I get to do it is just getting to read work that I might have missed otherwise. And just that made me so energized personally and inspired to go and be a better journalist next week. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Anne.
Thank you so much, Tasneem. And just echoing the inspiration that I am also taking away from this conversation, and really appreciate the time and thoughts that Kate and Natalie and Ashley and Lawrence have shared with us. So just thank you again. And thanks also to my Pulitzer Center colleagues, especially Holly Rosewood, our producer for this session, and of course to Deirdre English and all of our partners at the Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. We really appreciate all of our audience members today for joining us and their questions. And for those of you who are able, please consider becoming a Pulitzer Center champion to support the work that we do in supporting journalists across the world and in our educational opportunities. A special note for our Berkeley students who are with us today, that they should be aware that today, March 4th, is the application deadline for the Pulitzer Center Campus Consortium Reporting Fellowship. Check in with your professors if you have any questions, and know that we have other publication opportunities via our Speaking Out on Climate Justice platform. You can learn more at pulitzercenter.org. Please stay with us just a bit longer to take a brief survey after we officially end. We are eager to hear from you. And remember that we will have a recording of this conversation for you to share with your communities, and we will be posting it online in the coming days at pulitzercenter.org. Thank you all again for joining us today, and goodbye for now.